Hello, and welcome to this week's Birth and Baby Talk. I'm Leanne Palmerston from Hamilton Family Doulas, and my lovely co-host is
Meaghan Grant, and I am from Toronto Family Doulas, Hamilton Family Doulas, and Family Doulas of Ottawa. And this week was my idea. We had something totally different originally planned, but I did not want to let June go by without talking about this subject. Obviously, over the last year, we've seen sort of inclusivity become a big topic in a lot of parenting circles in a lot of different ways. June is both Pride, but it is also Indigenous History Month. So this felt like a really good moment to stop and sort of talk about what that all means in the context of parenting and raising inclusive kids. And, you know, this idea that I think a lot of us come back to of leaving a better world for our children than the one we inhabit. And so, you know, I'm going to give sort of as our social media has been sort of teasing up until this point, I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit of my story and my family's story. Now, Leanne obviously knows this and has been well aware of this story for years now. I do want to preface this story by saying I have permission to tell it. And this is going to become significant in a minute so people will understand why. But I do want everybody to know that my son, Quentin, has given permission for this story to be shared. Now, I asked if he wanted to pop on at the beginning today, and he very politely went bright pink and said, "No, thank you, Mommy." I was like, okay, that's fair. You don't need to hop on. But when Quentin, who is about to turn 9, he turns 9 next month. So about 4 years ago, shortly before his 5th birthday, he came to me during a bedtime snuggle and burst into tears because this is when my kids like to hit us. They always like to hit us when we're either in the car or in bed at bedtime for snuggles. And it's like, you want to hit me when there's not a lot of prep for this. And what had happened was there had been a bullying incident at daycare, and it centered around Quentin wearing dresses from the dress-up center. And he had been teased, and several of the kids, one in particular, had sort of said, "Dresses are for girls, you can't wear dresses." And Quentin looks at me and he's like, he's nearly 5, so he's still quite young and small, and he's got these big tears in his eyes. He goes, "But I just want to wear dresses." And I was like, okay, so we'll go buy you a dress. Like, in our world, this wasn't a big deal. And in part, that's because both my husband and I, we have LGBTQ friends and family members. So we've sort of incorporated queer support culture to an extent into just our general parenting, and always have. Yeah. But it really, like, Quentin went, "Wait, what?" Like, he didn't think, and I was like, I don't know where you've gotten the impression that we wouldn't have supported this, but I guess when you're 4 and you're taking this big step out of what are very obvious gender norms, it was a big deal for him. And so that was his coming out story. And what I love about his coming out story is it's brief. It was telling, accepting, moving on. And that is not to say that his story is over, because as any LGBTQ person will tell you, you're never done coming out. You will always be coming out to new friends, to coworkers, to jobs, to any environment you find yourself in. There is always an aspect of coming out. But the beauty for my child in particular is that Quentin is in an environment where this is much more tolerated, accepted, supported. And so we've been very, very blessed as a family. And sort of to give the continuation of that, absolutely, we have dealt with bullying. That's part of the reason this is a big sort of deal, and something I really wanted to talk about this month, because these are the kids that go to school with my child. And, it's not that we think, and to be clear to people, when I say Quentin wanted to wear a dress and Quentin came out, Quentin has come out as transgender. He continues to use male pronouns. He has not changed his name at this point. He is still not in puberty. We are far away from medical transition of any type. We're not even sure if that is something Quentin will want to pursue, nor will I probably talk about that in great detail on a public page like this should Quentin make that choice in the future. But that's one of the sort of big pushbacks on kids coming out as trans. Quentin identifies as non-binary, gender neutral, gender creative. We sort of have gone through a number of terms over the years. He tends to prefer sort of the umbrella of trans and just sort of exist within that bubble. And we are perfectly happy at this point in time to follow his lead and sort of go with that. Now, what does that mean in terms of school? We've been so lucky. Durham District School Board is our homeschool board, and they are really wonderful about supporting queer students. So we have had a lot of support, but most people aren't used to 4-year-olds coming out. This is a bit of a shock for some people. So there have been learning and adjustment periods for everybody involved, including us. Adam, my husband, and I are far from perfect. And there have definitely been moments where Quentin has said something and we've both gone, oh, you took that the wrong way. That was not what we meant. Oh, dear. Tick 1 on the board for your future therapy sessions. So, you know, I want to be clear in all of this that this advice that we are giving today is really from our perspective as parents who have done our best to raise inclusive kids. We are not experts or academics on this topic at all. It's just something that, you know, inclusivity is a big piece of our practice as doulas and as people and parents. And so we wanted to bring some of our advice to all of you. Now today, simply because it is sort of the sphere that I know best, I'm going to be relating most of this back to LGBTQ kids and experiences in communities. I am not Indigenous. I am not First Nations. I don't feel like I can comment on that experience because it's not who I am. That being said, we will be over the rest of the month making sure that we have some resources put up so that people can access those resources in particular for this month. Now, first things first, when it comes to supporting LGBTQ kids and communities and raising inclusive kids, is you start with you. You can't raise an inclusive child if you yourself don't have the information. And I know it feels like every single sort of group is looking for everyone to be educated. And as I've said to others, you know, we can be committed as people to social justice. We can be committed to inclusivity. We can't be informed completely on every single issue. It's just not possible. Human beings don't have that much brain space, nor do we have that kind of time in our lives. It would take several lifetimes to be fully informed on every single issue of bias and discrimination that exists. That is the reality of the world. That is the reality of capitalism and white supremacy and heteronormativity and all of those things. So you have to pick and choose to an extent what you put your focus on. But you can put your focus in milder ways that educate you on the basics so that when questions and concerns and issues come up with your children, you, if nothing else, know that you don't know enough. And you can say, you know what, that's a really great question. I don't know enough about that topic either. Let's look it up together. You know, being able to recognize when you have the information and when you don't is a really big part actually of raising inclusive kids, because you're also going to have to teach them how to find this information when they need it. This is a lifelong process. It doesn't stop just because you've read all the right books. That would be lovely, but that's not how life works. So it's really about finding that space and finding that time to at least have a basic understanding of a lot of the issues your kids are going to encounter. And Leanne, I think your kids were a little bit older than Quentin was, but one of the biggest things we've found is that people have this perception that younger kids don't know. Yeah. And that is whether we're talking race, gender, sexuality, any of those things. And yet, in particular, in the queer community, if you go back and ask them, they'll be like, oh yeah, I was 3 years old and I pulled out those Barbies something fierce and like I knew then. But adults have this idea that kids don't know. Well, kids do. And this is both just anecdotally from the experiences of trans and queer people, but this is also scientific. Developmentally, kids gain an understanding of gender as a construct between the ages of 2 and 4, and a concept of self-identity and self-gender between the ages of 4 and 7. So just purely, and for those of you who know me, you know I come from a developmental background. So this is a piece of where I come from in terms of my professional career. This is normal. This is when kids will experiment too. You might see your little boy playing mom when they're playing house. My favorite is kids who are pretending to breastfeed after a sibling is born. This is a really common one. And I have definitely seen parents who are like, oh my gosh, my baby boy is pretending to breastfeed. Yeah, so what? They have memory.
Yeah, eventually he'll understand what parts work which way. But now he can role play being a nurturer, which is an amazing thing to do.
Absolutely.
When he was very small, Spencer was he kept stealing all of my teaching dolls. And eventually I made him a sling so that he could, like an African style wrap sling, so he could wear his baby doll, which, you know, was supposed to be my teaching doll. He could wear that doll around and nurture it. And it's sweet and lovely. And it is really sort of in the norm of expressive play, trying on identities that small kids and, preschoolers and toddlers tend to do.
That's a really good point. And it's one that I don't know that I necessarily planned to bring up today, but this idea of trying on identities. This is something we have encountered, especially because Quentin has not changed pronouns or socially transitioned to being a girl, or presenting as a girl. So we've gotten a lot of, well, what if it's just a phase? Mm-hmm. Who cares? Who cares?
It's a phase, yeah.
I went through a phase of being super girly. I went through a phase of being super nerdy. I went through a phase of like playing Dungeons and Dragons. And let me be honest, that was one of my more regrettable phases because that wasn't what I enjoyed. So we all go through phases. We all try on different identities. That's part of growing up. And if we stopped imposing these really rigid gender norms on our children and let them try on these identities, then all that does is gives them a better understanding of who they are when they're grown.
Exactly.
All it does is help them know who they are as an adult.
Exactly. And trying on those kinds of identities, like a whole, not just the sort of role-playing, nurturing roles and things that are typically assigned to females in our social constructs of gender. But when they're teenagers, they're supposed to go through a massive set of trying on different identities in the sense, when I was a teenager, it was, I was a mod, and then I was a punk, and then I was an artsy artsy, and then I was some kind of like Edwardian poet. Like I really wanted to be not Mary Shelley, but I wanted to be Percy Shelley. And I would wear, velvet waistcoats and stuff. And so I went through all of these identities until I started to feel which parts of them were me and retain them, and then built who I am now. I mean, I've changed and grown, but like I decided what fit for me, what parts of those identities. And yeah, that's really normal for teenagers. And a part of that can be exploring gender expression, exploring sexual expression and things like that as well.
Absolutely. And, I also want to impress upon people, just because these are the questions that we get. Gender identity is completely separate from sexuality. Yes. So that is where we are coming from on this topic, just so everybody is sort of on the same page. Gender identity is who you are inside. Sexual identity is who you are attracted to, who you love, who you are physically intimate with.
So both of those are independent from physical, biological sex.
Yes.
right? So
Absolutely.
you can be born one sex and decide, like one biological sex, and decide to transform that, over time. You can be raised with a particular gender expression and choose to change and flip that around over time. And you can also become and shift in your sexual like your sexual identity, who it is that are the people who, sit inside your soul with you for life. So those things can be fluid, but a lot of kids know really early, like you were saying before. They have an internal gut sense, just like me as a fairly typical straight woman. I always kind of knew that I was straight inside. Right. I always also knew that my gender expression was also very sort of a fluid thing. And, and for me, for having kids, like, of course, both of my children are non-binary. So, and both of them have come out as non-binary, and like you said earlier, that coming out process, they announced that to us as parents, and we were like, okay, cool. Like, you can be whoever you want. You just, tell us what you need from us. But then they have these series of delicate conversations with other people in families when they gently correct them. No, not he, they. Because both of my children identify as non-binary. They present most of the time quite masculine, but they both prefer non-binary pronouns. So they, them. Although my younger child, who is 13, about to turn 14, very exciting. When every once in a while, I talk to the kids, I open up these conversations and say, like, hey, like, so what's going on with you? Like, what is it? What would you prefer? And the youngest was like, nah, I don't care. And I'm like, okay, cool. So sometimes our kids know that they might be different than what people consider the norm, but they also could not care what other people do and say and think. So.
Well, and it's funny because Quentin, we also check in with Quentin on a regular basis, just because, he is sort of starting to head into puberty. Heaven help me. I don't feel old enough to have a child in puberty, but that's a different issue. And that is when, for a lot of trans children who have maybe been a little bit more ambivalent about their body and dysmorphia, that sort of thing, up until that point, things start to change just because their bodies become less androgynous. It becomes a little bit harder for them to maybe present the way they see themselves internally. So we check in with him on a regular basis. Now, for us, everyone always loves, Quentin was quite intuitive in the way he described it to us. And when I tell people, everyone's always like, oh, that's the sweetest thing I've ever heard. When we sort of talked to Quentin about all of this, and he said, like, I'm different, he didn't necessarily have the language for it, just because while we had talked about the existence of trans people, he hadn't yet applied it to himself. When we talked about how you feel inside and who you love and all of those differences, and he goes, well, inside, I have a half boy heart and a half girl heart. And that was how he described to us he felt and his sort of transness and his gender identity. So we check in with him on a regular basis over whether or not he wants us to change his pronouns, if he wants to change his name, if he wants us to use Quinn, which is a little bit more gender neutral rather than Quentin. And he's always been quite happy to keep his name. His friends call him all manner of versions of it. But he's happy for us to call him Quentin and to continue to use male pronouns. But we asked him how he wanted to be identified on the census, and he wanted to be identified as non-binary. So we're starting to see a little bit more sort of awareness of the external perception. Now, all of this, I think, comes back to what I said earlier of being educated yourself. Obviously, you're not going to be super 100% educated on the issues that trans kids and trans adults and parents of trans children face, but you can be a little bit more informed than you probably are. You can understand some of the limitations to the legislation we currently have in place protecting trans people. Yes, great C16 passed and trans is now a protected class, but there are still a lot of barriers for trans people just to exist. Healthcare for trans people is a huge issue. I can't stress that enough. We talk about Canadians having universal health care. That is a bit of a misnomer when it comes to certain communities, and the trans community is certainly one that does not have the same kind of equitable access to health care that you and I do. They can't just walk into an emergency room and have a doctor and expect a doctor to understand how their hormones might affect, their hormone replacement therapy might affect any potential treatments they do in the ER. Heaven help a trans man who is pregnant who walks into an ER. They don't know what to do with that man. They are completely lost and confused. And it's an incredibly traumatizing event for a trans man in that scenario. And to sort of go back to that educating yourself, one of the accounts, I do a lot of following people on social media, as I'm sure we all do, although I will admit to being the fuddy-duddy waving her cane at the kids to get off the lawn. Leanne laughs at me. I am not a TikTok person. But Danny the Trans Dad is an account that I follow, and I have followed in love with Danny and his child Wilder, who is just the cutest baby you've ever seen in your life. They just absolutely light up a room with their smile. And Danny describes having COVID early in his pregnancy and the treatment he received in the ER. And it's incredibly harrowing to listen to because Danny is in the US, but I don't want to pretend that the Canadian system handles emergency trans healthcare any better than the American system does, because frankly, it doesn't. So you can sort of start to educate yourself, not just on the issues that, are detrimental to the trans community, but also on the things that are beneficial to the trans community. The big one, and people who have listened to me and know me will hear me rail about this, the health curriculum that was canceled by the current government. I'm going to be political for a second here. That change directly impacted my family. And what it did is it removed trans as an identity and as information from the elementary school curriculum, which essentially was the government telling my child that his mere existence is so controversial that his peers shouldn't know about it. That is an incredibly political statement. And I know that we are going to get hate mail over this. I know there are going to be people who disagree with me on that health curriculum. And in case you don't realize, when I say health curriculum, I'm talking about sex ed. I'm talking about sex ed. So, we knowing the things that will benefit the trans community and advocating for those things is equally as important as being aware of the things that are harming the trans community and working to reduce those harms. It is about more than harm reduction. It is about a community being able to thrive. Yeah. And so that is, as you're educating yourself, don't, just like a lot of the Black activists I follow will say, don't just focus on Black trauma. Don't just focus on enslavement. Don't just focus on, the negatives. Focus on the scientists and the mathematicians and the artists and the poets. Focus on the successes. Focus on, give that credit and give that attention and give that support, because those things, it's about more than lives mattering. It's about lives thriving. And that is true whatever group you're talking about. Now, how do you bring this back to your kids? Because obviously I can talk till I'm blue-faced, sun up, sun down, ways people can educate themselves on this too. But disseminating it to a child is a different story. So let's start with stories, because they are the best way to help kids learn in a lot of contexts.
Yes.
Between 4 years ago and now, when Quentin came out to now, the amount of literature that is out there for kids has just simply exploded. And it is thrilling to see. I remember, when all of this first came out, there were definitely books that came out. A Princess Boy was one of our favorites. I Am Jazz, was a television show, and books at that point. But it was still sort of a bit of a quieter issue. Now you can walk in. I mean, right now walk in to any stores that have a street entrance and are at 15% capacity. But you can go into a store, especially in June, and the Pride displays are very prominent. I remember Quentin's first Pride summer, it was, 4 years ago. I couldn't find a rainbow shirt for my child to save my life. Now I go on and I mean, yes, some of it is rainbow washing, which is an issue we can talk about another day, corporations capitalizing on pride. But the fact that this stuff is even available now is so different than it was 4 years ago. Yeah. I can now get my child a Pride shirt, and it's not a special order item. It's not something I have to spend hours searching for. It is prominent on kids' clothing websites. It's easy to find. So we're seeing this, but the books are my favorite part. There are books about families with same-sex parents. There are books about families with trans parents. There are books about kids coming out, whether it's as trans or as gay or as bisexual or as agender or aromantic. There are so many more resources out there for kids. And there is now, our Ottawa website is a little bit wonky at the moment, but once it eventually comes back up when the domain issue gets sorted out, there's a blog up this week that actually has my top 10 favorite books, 0 to 3, 4 to 7, 7 to 10, and then one that's just really great for sort of the whole family. And so once our website is working again, I will share that link so that people can take a look, because this is a really important way of getting into your kids and just normalizing different families and different gender identities, different sexualities. It's not, I think we, as parents, we have this idea we have to actively teach, sit down and have tough conversations and actively teach. But that's not always how kids learn. We all know that kids don't learn when they sit in a desk in a single file row and stare at the front of the classroom. Sorry, teachers. But we know that that's not always the best way for kids to learn. And so the best way with all of this, especially with sort of like the 7 and under set, just incorporate these things. Buy the books. Don't ask your kid about buying the books. Just buy the books. Read them. Make sure your kids' bookshelves are diverse. I remember looking at Quentin's bookshelf and going, every single character is either white or an animal. And every animal character uses male pronouns. Look over your kids' books and see if there are any female protagonist animals. I can almost guarantee there's not, unless it's about like a female girl issue.
Yeah, there's moms and children in animal books, but that's the extent of it.
The hero of the book is always male. So here's a really quick, simple, before you go out and spend a ton of money, because we get it, not everybody can go out and buy several $100s worth of picture books at once. Take the books you've had and change up the pronouns.
Yeah.
Refer to the male identifying characters as female. Refer to female identifying characters as male. You're already creating an impression in your child's mind that how a person looks, their expression, is not necessarily relevant to how they feel inside. That's a huge piece of this.
Exactly. And if you're like 18-month-old says, but wait, isn't that a boy? Or isn't that a girl? If you're swapping genders and stuff, that's your opportunity to say, well, sometimes boys can wear clothes that we think of as girl clothes. Sometimes they choose to do that. And then you can start little conversations. And I promise you too, as parents, I'm sure with every difficult discussion with very small children, that gives us parents the nerves. The kids are like, oh, cool, and move straight on. It's like sex, gender, what trans means, all of that. They're like, what the heck is that? And then you say, oh, it's this thing. And they're like, oh, cool, can I have a popsicle? So they're taking in this information, but they're also not they're not asking you to become an investigative reporter. So I also want to impress on parents that while we do think that it's super important to make sure that you have a level of comfortableness with, like just what's going on in the world for queer LGBTQ plus families out there and peoples out there. If you don't know it all, it's okay. You don't have to be the expert. You can also say, hey, why don't we look that up together?
Normalizing not knowing is fabulous, because that sets your child up for a lifetime of curiosity, and curiosity might kill the cat, but it is also a great thing in an ever-changing world. And that actually, Leanne, that reminds me so much of one of my favorite coming out stories for Quentin is we had sort of let his teachers know that all of this was going on. They were very, very supportive. And of course, like, Quentin never has done anything by half measures. So within a week of coming out, he was wearing hot pink and purple rain boots and a dress to school, which was fabulous. We supported it. I will admit, Mama Bear was nervous. It's impossible to, as a parent, send your queer child that first time in a dress. And especially when the whole conversation came out because of a bullying incident, I was terrified in my heart, but, my boy was growing, my baby was growing up. And his teacher said to us afterwards, they said, so we were watching really closely because we sort of were worried that there would be issues. She goes, and one of the kids, one of his friends came up to him and said, well, why are you wearing purple boots? Those are for girls. And she goes, and we were ready to jump in when Quentin goes, because I like them and that's the only reason I need, and stomped across the room. And that was the last time that child brought it up. It was never an issue after that because Quentin made it clear, this has nothing to do with anything except what I like. And I will tell you, Quentin picked his first pair of purple and pink sparkly shoes when he was 2. So this was, I will be honest, yes, Quentin came out at 4, but this was not necessarily the biggest surprise in the world for us. We had seen a love of pink and purple and dolls and stuffies and all of that long before Quentin ever even told us. Really, he was 2 the first time he picked those shoes, the first time he picked a pink blankie at a store. We saw some of the signs earlier in his life just in terms of his preferences.
Yeah.
And that's also going to sort of come to my next point, which is that being comfortable saying you don't know the answer, being comfortable looking things up with your child, and also just not being embarrassed by those questions. Okay. Yeah. I guarantee you, your child is going to ask something embarrassing about a minority group when you are out in public, and they are going to ask it loudly, and you are going to be mortified. As a parent of 2, I promise that day is coming. And I'm sure you've had those moments.
So I also have the unique life circumstance where my parents had a baby when I was 14. So I went through one of those weird, teenage hoods where I was like a little mom to my little baby sister. And I didn't drive as a teenager, so we took the bus all the time. And I very distinctly remember being on the bus with my 4-year-old sister and her pointing to a Black man who was sitting in front of us and said, why does that man's hair look like wool? And I said, well, immediately I was mortified, of course, because I did not want the person in front of us to feel like he was being especially and badly pointed out or spoken of course. But I did just handle it like, oh, well, of course he has different hair. I have different hair than you do. And that lady over there has different hair too. Isn't that cool? Everybody has different colors and textures of hair. And so we sort of veered away from what could be a really weird conversation if I was like, well, there are people with different skin colors and things, which is, I think, what a lot of nervous parents might feel compelled to, and just talked about the fact that difference is normal.
Yep.
And that, I think, is one of the biggest underlying values. We like different things. And, you know, like as a family, we love things that are different from other people. We don't like to march to the same drummer, and differences abound within the world in all kinds of things. And so being open to difference and not being afraid of difference, again, like, you know, when you were saying Quinn came to you and was like, I want to wear purple boots and, you know, like these sparkly tights, like, you know, part of you was like, I want to protect you from any dangers that might come your way and any heartache that you might experience. But at the same time, you have to just be fearless and be like, this kid knows what they're doing. I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to say yes to these things and allow those things to happen. Let it just unfold in front of you, because then, like, because the kid, it's not stigmatized for the children. They don't see it.
This comes back to this idea, I think, that hate is taught. You know, kids are not born with inherent prejudices. And I'm not talking about like biological, yes, there are, you know, lizard brain, identify your tribe, but we can, you know, that's a whole thing that is overcomable through education. But generally speaking, kids don't look at other people and ascribe a negative to a group. They just see something different than what they've experienced before. And this, again, kids who, why, what's that? Why now? Who?
Exactly. For the most part, they're curious about differences.
They're
like, that's cool.
They're like, really actually just trying to categorize their world.
Yeah, exactly.
And really understand what they're seeing and experiencing. So one of the best pieces of advice I can give for parents on that is actually to develop some scripts for yourself beforehand. It feels super awkward. I know, it's like, what do you mean I have to like memorize an answer? This feels like grade 10, you know, English class all over again. No, I'm talking about having some ready-made answers available to draw on so that in the moment you don't panic. And these are very, very simple. As Leanne said, well, look around us. Everybody's hair is different. Let's talk. You can even say, like, adults, when they hear a child asking questions and they hear the adult with that child answering those questions in a respectful way, they tend to actually not mind so much about the continued conversation. This is particularly true with the queer community because they want everything normalized. The queer community is not a monolith. I am not the spokesperson for the monolith of the queer community. But generally speaking, the messages I hear from trans people, the trans community, activists in the queer community, that teaching kids, normalizing answering these questions makes the lives of queer people easier. So there's a big, big debate right now, Leanne. I don't know if you've caught this, because with Pride here canceled for a second year, it's maybe not quite gotten here yet. There's a huge debate this year over the inclusion of kink in Pride. Now, for anybody who does not have a really, you know, strong background in the history of Pride, the kink community, the leather community, has always been a very big, very vital component of the queer community. And so now, as Pride becomes more commercialized, less about a protest, less about throwing bricks at cops, and more about family-friendly events, there has been this pushback on the inclusion of kink and leather people, the leather community in Pride. And it's this idea of, well, what if my kid asks? They're playing dress up.
Yeah.
Like the answers can be that simple. You don't need to give more detail than your 4-year-old can understand. You don't need to go into conversations about, you know, things that are like way above your pay grade or way above your child's sort of ability to understand. It can be as simple as, well, those are the clothes that make that person feel really confident.
Yeah.
Those are, you know, that's how, you know, you see a person in a dress who looks masculine. They have a beard, but maybe they're also wearing makeup. They've got a skirt on, but they have body hair. You know, these are, for adults, let's be real, this makes us uncomfortable because this is very contrary to the idea of gender roles and gender norms, but also just North American and Western beauty standards generally, of like skinny and blonde and blue-eyed and like hairless women and all of these things. You know, all of this actually comes back to and feeds into transphobia and queerphobia. So really just having these scripts where you can say, well, you know, think about your clothes. What is your favorite outfit? What makes you feel the most confident? Oh, your purple dress with the unicorn on front. You're right. You do feel really confident when you're in that dress. I can see it. Well, that person is wearing an outfit and a dress up that makes them feel really confident and makes them feel special. And so that's why they're dressed like that today.
Exactly.
It's that simple. You don't, you know, why are two boys kissing? Because they love each other.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
Same reason if you are married or if you have a partner, same reason mommy and daddy or mommy and mummy kiss, you know, it's no different. If you normalize it and you make the answers very sort of matter of fact, it's not, really the biggest thing is take your fear out of it. Take your discomfort out of it, because that's what you transfer to your child.
Exactly. And I think the very simplest way now, Meaghan is very aware of my little trick that I have always taken with my kids. Whenever they ask a question that's potentially uncomfortable, I always start with enthusiasm and an emphasis on learning. So I always say, well, that's a great question. That's my first thing. That gives me a moment to gather my thoughts and think, how am I going to approach answering this question? And then I say whatever the answer is, but I look at it like everything is a moment of learning. Like the world is a grand science experiment that we just get to go, wow, cool, look at that cool thing I just learned. And not like, this is a grave, serious situation that we're going to talk to. And while there are places, of course, in our lives for sitting down and saying, this is a serious conversation that we're going to have about something, when, especially on this, like for the, you know, that sort of 8 and under zone where kids are still very much little kids. They're not transitioning into teenagers yet. They don't yet have a
My
more...
8-year-old might take umbrage with that.
But you know what I mean? Like after about 8, they start to become tweens. So they start to take on some young adult kind of world visions. Like they start to see farther and farther, and they start to see society as a whole, and they start to think about their place within it. When they're little kids, they're really focused on their own immediate experiences. So they're not thinking like there is a wider queer community out here that we're discussing. They're just thinking like, why does Uncle John always hang out with that guy, George? Like, what's up with that? And then you say, oh, well, they kind of really like each other the way mom and dad like each other. And they're spending time to see if they want to spend the rest of their lives together, just like us. And they're like, okay, cool. Can I have a cookie now? Like that's how little children act. And so, you know, like just looking at it like, oh my God, what a great question, validates our children that they're not asking stuff that's scary. Because again, generations that came before us always sort of inherently taught that or covertly taught that discussing things like gender and sexuality and stuff were taboo. We don't talk about that stuff. We don't talk about what's inside people's pants or, you know, those kinds of things, when really like kids love conversations about that, but they like little tiny bits of information. They don't want to talk about it for a half hour, so don't get scared.
I would say the other piece of that is parents who want to raise inclusive kids, who have already started to do some of this work. And I will admit, I have totally made this mistake. Oversharing is a thing. These kids are still small. They don't need like the half an hour explanation. So one of the other tricks or tools in the toolbox here is, well, what do you think they're doing that for? Why do you think they're wearing that dress? The answers will shock you.
Yeah. They might say like, is it laundry day and they don't have any other clothes left?
Or the best is, you know, kids who are like, why are they wearing that? And the parents are like, oh my gosh, they're asking why that masculine presenting person is wearing a dress. And really what they mean is like, why are they wearing high heels? Or why are they wearing big sparkly ear? Like, sometimes it has nothing to do with what you think it does. So if you say, well, why
are they wearing
that
sequins during the day?
Yeah, like, why are they wearing, what are the fake eyelashes? Fake eyelashes, like, really capture kids' attention. So, like, sometimes it's not what you think they're asking about, and you launch into this explanation, and you get to the end of it, and the kids are like, I just wanted to know about their eyes. You're like, oh, those are fake eyelashes. You can go to the salon and put on, and then they're like, okay, like, can I have my popsicle now? Like, who are you and why are we talking about this? So get some feedback from your kids. Really sort of let them lead the conversation. This is true in just about all things. Letting your kids lead the conversation helps you as a parent to stay within really what they're ready to learn. You know, you can talk all day and all night, but kids aren't going to absorb it if they're not ready to hear it. So it's, you know, giving them that opportunity to frame and shape the conversation helps prevent you from having that panic, because you know exactly what information they're trying to access, and you can provide it. And if you don't know the answer, then that's a great time to say, that's a great question. You know what? I don't know the answer either. Let's look it up together. And that's where you start to sort of really create and foster this opportunity for inclusivity and diversity to just be a sort of foundation of your family and your parenting.
Yes. I think for me, a really important thing in my parenting has been a willingness to say yes. You know, like there's this idea in comedy where you say yes and. Yes and means when someone else comes to you with an idea, you greenlight it. You say yes, and then you add on to it. So I like to use this with parenting in the sense that, you know, when my then 8-year-old child came to me and said, oh, if we're going to the mall, can I go into the makeup store with you and buy nail polish? Yes. So we went in, we bought nail polish. The first nail polish was a much more masculine friendly, bright blue color. And that was cool. The next time we went, there were 3 hot pink, sparkly, fiery red nail polishes that came home with us. And I just was like, you know what? We're just going to do this. Even though my assigned male at birth child wanted to wear hot pink nail polish, ultimately I had to say, like, I had to overcome any weirdness I might be feeling and just say, yeah, let's do that. I'm willing to let you express yourself. And, you know, when Quentin wanted those purple boots, you got those purple boots and let Quentin.
I was jealous of the purple boots.
Right?
I'm being honest. Like, if I'm being honest, my kid dresses better than I do. His current thing is anything unicorn, literally everything unicorn.
Yeah.
Like his bedroom, his linens, his entire summer wardrobe, because of course he just had a massive growth spurt and nothing he knows fits anymore. So, you know, several shopping orders later, he is decked from head to toe in unicorn. And I will say, you know, for anyone who doesn't know my family really well, even my younger child, I wouldn't call him gender conforming by any means. Miles desperately needs a haircut at the moment, but his hair comes down to about just a couple of inches above his elbow. His nails are currently bright blue. And at the moment he is wearing hot pink denim Bermuda shorts. So, you know, my clearly gender roles and gender norms are not a thing that really exists in my household. But I guess the sort of last piece of advice that I want to give parents on raising inclusive kids is be prepared to keep your discomfort separate. This is particularly true if your child comes out. It can be hard for parents. I don't want to pretend that I didn't have moments where I worried about my child's future. I still have moments. I have encountered some really ugly people at corners of the internet in advocating for my child and in being open about our family's experiences. I have been sent some really horrifying messages that I should be in jail, that I'm a pedophile, that I deserve to be harmed because I'm quote unquote doing harm to my child. There are terrible people out there who believe terrible things about the queer community, and you will encounter them if your child comes out. Like it's impossible to avoid them, and it sucks. And I can't and won't sugarcoat that. And that can lead to a lot of feelings as a parent. It can lead to worries that your plans for your child aren't going to happen. You know, I have talked to parents of trans sons who they have to mourn the idea of wedding dress shopping with their assigned female at birth child. They have to, you know, lots of parents have this idea that trans and queer people can't have families. They can absolutely have families, but there is a mourning, just like when you have a child with a disability or you have a child who struggles in other ways, you as a parent do in a way have to mourn for the future that you had hoped for your child. And I certainly look at the world some days and wonder what kind of a world I am sending my child out into, and it terrifies me as a parent. But I can't pass that on to my child. I have to separate that. There's a concept in grief circles called comfort in, dump out. So that is the closer to, I hate to call coming out as a traumatizing event because it shouldn't be. And for many people, it's not. And for many people, it is. But whoever is closest to the event, you dump the, you think of it as like circles in a when you drop a stone in a pond. It's the ripples. Each circle has to put the comfort into the closer circle and dump their emotions out to the outer circle. So I, as a parent, do not put my fears on my child. I can express my fears to my support circle, my therapist, other parents of trans kids, my business partners. Trust me, Leanne and Alex and Meaghan have heard all of this angst multiple times over the years, you know, as we all worry about raising our kids. You know, so I dump out. I don't dump on my child, and I never will. You know, yes, I mean, as I sit up here and I say this quite loudly with my child downstairs doing virtual school, but he doesn't hear the day-to-day worries. He doesn't hear, you know, my frustration when there was a bullying incident at the school and I didn't really love how it was handled. He wasn't aware of my ire. All he knew was that I had gone to the school and advocated on his behalf. He didn't know that I wasn't happy with the response. So you can't put those fears on your child, because what kids take away from that is there's something wrong with them. That's not what you mean, and it's not what you're thinking, but kids take these things in a very, very literal way. They hear you say, I'm worried for your future, and their immediate internalization is, my future is scary.
Yeah.
And that's not what you want. That's not sort of the recipe for a positive coming out. That is not the sense you want your child to have. You don't want, especially if your child comes out as trans, yes, there is an element of grief, but don't tell your child you're grieving, because in their head, this is who they've always been. Yeah. And you've always loved them. So this idea that you are now grieving them can be really painful. And this is who your child has always been. There's a change in clothing and of pronouns and names, but your child is still the same child you have held and snuggled and loved all of these years. And yes, there's a period of adjustment, but it has to be dealt with elsewhere. Yeah. You can't put that on the community. And this is true outside of LGBTQ circles. This is the same idea of not expecting the emotional labor of oppressed groups to educate you or to support you. You have to go and find that support in other places. Therapy is great. All of us here are huge proponents of therapy to work through the things you need to work through. Finding queer-friendly therapists is hugely important. We have done that. Quentin is in therapy now for anxiety. Another thing he is always given me permission to discuss. You know, and so I actually said that would be important earlier, and then I totally forgot. Part of the not putting all of this on your kid is not telling their story. They might be ready to come out to you and not be ready to come out to grandma, or not be ready to come out to Uncle John, or not be ready to come out at school, or to their hockey team, or anywhere else. Not your story to tell.
Yeah.
Like, period, end of conversation. And it can be really hard not to want to tell your story, that story, because it can be, for you, it might be a huge, like, you're happy and you're proud. We were. For us, that Quentin really knew who he was. We thought that was amazing. And I mean, he wanted everybody to know. He announced it literally on 680 News about 6 months after coming out while we were at a rally over the health curriculum. But so like he literally announced it to the world, but not all people are going to be like that. So really, you know, part of the comfort in is really following the lead of the person at the center of all of this. And this is the queer child. And really sort of centering their feelings and thoughts and experiences. And that includes their coming out story. That includes any plans for transition, any medical details. Oh my gosh, I'm not gonna lie. The number of parents I see sharing details about their trans child's transition, that all I can think is, if I was your child, I would be mortified by this.
Yeah.
You know, listen, I'm not going to, you know, judge other parents of trans kids, because we are all walking a path without a lot of guidance. There is definitely no rule book for this. And there's no parenting manual, but really be aware. If it's not something you would want shared about you, think about it before you share it about your child. These are in particular are very sensitive issues that can in the future affect your child. And I hate to say it, but the reality is that trans people are still underemployed compared to cis people. Trans people are still underhoused compared to cis people. Trans people still are underrepresented in just about every single field and sphere in our society in comparison to cis people. And so sharing these details, particularly in public forums like Facebook, our lives are lived on social media now. When you share these details without your child's permission, the reality is it may come back and bite them in the ass later on down the road, and that's definitely not what you want. So really sort of being aware, following your child's lead. And listen, if your child is like, yeah, tell the world I don't care, this is who I am, and nothing's going to change that, great. Share your story just like I am, because I cannot tell you, especially in the last year, that's part of why I really wanted to do this month. In the last year, I've seen a huge increase in parenting groups of parents coming forward and saying, my child is expressing that their gender is maybe not completely in alignment with their sex assigned at birth. Whether that is non-binary, whether that is just they, you know, assigned male children who are just a little bit more effeminate. I realize society views that in a negative light. I don't. It's just like we don't call things boy clothes and girl clothes. We call them masculine and feminine. Just because I kind of had to find a way to identify the sections of the store, but clothes are for everybody. And scripts. Give your kids those same scripts.
Yeah.
So, brain is all over the place on this one. But really, you know, sharing your kid's story, and part of that sharing of the story is if they are choosing to share their own story, just as scripts can be valuable for you, scripts can be valuable for your child in asking really common questions. We did this with Quentin. He used to get asked a lot. He doesn't wear dresses as much anymore, much to my dismay, because he looked so cute in them. But it's like legging life in our household for both of my kids. And as I said, unicorn everything. So he gets asked a lot, why are you wearing pink? Why is your hair purple? We've been dyeing his hair since he was 5. Why is your hair purple? Pink is for girls. So we developed a script with him of clothes are for everybody. Colors are for everybody. And now he has a quick response when someone asks him a question. And honestly, those responses shut other kids down instantly and shut adults down instantly. As soon as a kid says to them, pink's not for girls, colors are for everybody. Let me tell you, that adult's mouth snaps shut and they go bright red and they stop talking.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of brilliant to witness. So, really raising inclusive kids is giving them the tools to be kind to their peers, but it's also giving them the tools to be kind to themselves if they are coming out. And I'll get back to that.
Raising inclusive kids is not like both Meaghan and I have queer/trans children who do express their gender differently and may identify differently, but not all kids will do that. But we still want to raise those kids inclusively as well. And one way that I think is really great is a really, really low key thing that you can do is to remember to use inclusive examples in your everyday conversation. So, sometimes like a parent might say, like, one day when you grow up to get married, or one day, like if you have children, well, I always tried to throw in a variety of things that might happen in the future. So I might say, well, when you fall in love with a woman or a man, or maybe you don't fall in love with a person, XYZ, whatever I was saying. So, because we often refer to, like, in your future life, when you're living in this circumstance that I'm living in your version, but when you talk about that version, it can be a much more inclusive thing. And that gives kids the signal to know, oh yeah, like, yeah, people can grow up to like have different types of relationships or be asexual, or like that's all of those versions are acceptable. I also say things like, if you choose to have children in the future, because some people don't, and there's still, it blows my mind, but there's still an incredible pressure for people to procreate. And, and the people who don't want to do that, like, they get treated poorly as well. And so, just making sure that when you're talking about stuff, you like include all kinds of examples, but don't do it like we're about to talk about, inclusive examples. Just pepper it in like you do salt and pepper in some mashed potatoes, right? You're just like perking up different ideas there for them, planting tiny seeds in their head that they will nurture and grow and use as they need.
It's really about normalizing it. It's about normalizing various relationships. It's about normalizing different gender identities. It's about normalizing, ending the gender roles and all of that, the expectations we have. I mentioned, Western North American beauty standards. All of it ties back in together. Leanne, you and I can literally talk for hours on this topic, I'm sure. But it's, as Leanne said, it's really about just, it's part of life. It's not a big, talking about the LGBTQ community is not one conversation where you sit down at the dinner table and everybody very seriously discusses this issue. It's about just including those examples in your life and including those communities in your life. Make sure you're going to cultural events. Make sure, connect with PFLAG. PFLAG in the GTA in particular is amazing. For our folks in Ottawa, there is the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, as well as, I believe it's called the Kind Space, but I might be wrong. It's obviously been a year and a bit since anything was open, so my brain is a bit fuzzy. But in Ontario in particular, we have really great resources. Some of those resources we will continue to share throughout the week, so feel free to follow up on any of our social media. For anyone who's not following that, Toronto Family Doulas, Hamilton Family Doulas, Birth and Baby Talk, and Family Doulas of Ottawa, all 4 of those accounts are constantly and consistently sharing information. This week, it's obviously all about pride and raising inclusive kids from an LGBTQ standpoint, but every week our topics are focused and we are continuing to share additional information beyond the show throughout the week in our social media. So if you don't want to miss anything, make sure you're following all 4 accounts. Also, Leanne, we have a newsletter that you, our technical guru, are responsible for. Thank goodness it's not me. So if you are not on our list, you definitely want to be. We share specials, we share coupon codes, we've had coupon codes from previous guests so that you can get sort of like access to some great opportunities. So really you want to make sure you're following that. Leanne will drop the link into the comment later. I will drop the link to our blog post in the comments if and when our website ever decides to fix itself. And by fix itself, I mean I have to figure out what's wrong. So really, follow along on all of our channels. We are sharing all of this, obviously, throughout this week, but we do continue to share this information across the board. Inclusivity is a huge part of our doula practice in all 3 agencies and is really the driving force behind our philosophy as doulas and as business owners. So obviously something that we will continue to share. For everybody who is celebrating Pride Month this month, we want to wish you the happiest Pride. Obviously, this is not the Pride any of us were hoping for. I'm sure we were all looking forward to being able to see each other in person again. The family Pride event down at the school on Church Street is a family favorite of ours, and to miss it for the 2nd year is heartbreaking, but hopefully next summer everything will be back in place. And for those of you who are observing, well, everybody should be observing Indigenous History Month this month, but we will also be sharing some resources for that over the rest of this month so that people who are in particular after all of the recent discoveries at residential schools are looking to have those conversations with their kids. We're going to share those resources as well.
All right. Thanks, folks. And we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. See you then.